Okay, for the second exam, we're going to review going over chapters 4 through 5, so 4 and 5, 26 and 27. Starting with chapter 4, market failure, where there are three areas in market failure. One is market power, secondly are externalities, and then the third is rivality. So with market failure, with market power first, we would be looking at monopolies, natural monopolies, and oligopolies. And of course, monopoly, our definition for a monopoly is that the firm is the market and the market is the firm. They're one and the same. There's only one competitor in that market. As opposed to oligopolies, oligopolies would be a handful of firms. And they share some characteristics, and those would be such things as high barriers to entry. And the high barriers to entry, the easiest one to think about would be in terms of in terms of the cost to kind of break into that market. To start an auto company, automobile manufacturer, for example, would be tens of billions of dollars to do that, right? So that would be for an oligopoly, and of course the same for a monopoly if you were talking about those. So there's a high barrier to entry and also a high barrier to exit, meaning that to leave, of course, you could shut down your business, but there would be legal issues that would be continuing for some time to come, for many, many years to come, in fact, in most cases. So that's monopoly and oligopoly. And in addition to that, they are what are called price makers rather than price takers. Price makers meaning that they have what? They have market power. They have price power. They have the ability to set prices. Again, monopoly and oligopoly. Natural monopoly, that's our code for utility. A utility would be electricity producer, Detroit DTE, Detroit Edison, or Indiana Michigan Power, electricity providers, right? And so what happens is that, of course, monopolies are illegal in the U.S., whereas natural monopolies are pretty standard, and they're governed by state rules, regulations that kind of provide the guidelines for these natural monopolies, for these utilities. So again, in this case, we're talking about electricity utilities or natural gas utilities, and the rationale behind it, real briefly, simply, there's more to this, but you can imagine if there were several providers of electricity for a given neighborhood, a given community, what would happen is that you would have delivering the power to those homes. You might have one block, you might have a half dozen providers, and that would necessitate a half dozen sets of power lines. You can just see the mess that could result. So the regulatory authorities that we have, government stepping in to address this market failure in the form of market power, would be such institutions as the Federal Trade Commission and also the Department of Justice, the Department of Justice Antitrust Division. And remember, whenever you see the word trust, that's monopoly. So anti-monopoly division, preventing firms from becoming monopolies. So these are there for the consumer's benefit, for the household as consumer for their benefit. And so just kind of keep that in mind. Just a couple of that would be at the federal level. They're also at the state level, et cetera. So this is addressing that first issue relating to market power. The next we're looking at is our externalities. So we're asking government to step in this case again, to address this market failure in the form of externalities. An external benefit, we're asking government so society wants something, and we're asking government to step in to kind of fill that void, to correct the market problems that we're seeing out there, the market failure. So in this case, there are two sides, external benefits and external cost. So an external benefit or a positive externality, there's not enough that's being produced or it's priced too high. So we ask government to step in to internalize this by adding to production. Again, the idea is that we ask government to bring that benefit into society. Society wants that benefit. They want that. And so The problem for society is, again, whatever it is, that good that we're talking about or service, it's priced too high, or there's just not enough being produced. So our example of this is education, K through 12 education, public colleges, universities. Without government being in that space, there would not be as much being produced. External benefit, internalizing that positive externality. So again, education is our example. For an external cost or a negative externality, it's the opposite is the case, where there's too much production or it's priced too low, so government is tasked with internalizing this, and they have adding to production, but reducing production is actually the case. So it's either going to be we want it priced higher, or we want reduced production, not added production. So example of this would be the production of electricity and the pollution that results therefrom. What I mean, so here's a scenario. Let's just back up for an external cost, and we're talking about pollution. So as household, as consumers, we like our goods and services at lower prices, right? The increased law of demand, the increase the quantity demanded, lower the price. And also, interestingly, is that the producer also likes their, not interestingly, of course, they like their cost to be as low as possible, et cetera. They like to produce as much as they can. So we as consumers want low prices and high production, and the producers also like low cost, not low prices to the consumer, but they like low cost, and they like to produce a lot of whatever it is that they're producing, right? So in this case, we ask government to step in to internalize that external, that negative externality, and the negative externality is pollution, the byproduct of all those low-cost options that are out there so far as producing electricity. So dirty coal, lignite, brown coal, as opposed to bituminous or anthracite type, the harder coal that's lower polluting, or moving on to like natural gas or some other alternative energy, like nuclear power, et cetera. So we ask government to do that, and when government says the way that they go about doing that is through organizations, through institutions like the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, where they say, okay, we're not going to tell you how to produce something, but we're going to say that we want you to reduce the amount of pollution, so you're going to cut it in half. In order to do that, the firm, of course, has to do what? It would increase their cost in terms of putting scrubbers on smokestacks, or changing from coal-fired plants to natural gas-fired plants, or constructing nuclear power plants, or using more solar energy, or wind turbines, et cetera. And that, of course, is a higher cost to the firm. And the firm, of course, would be passing those costs on because, again, this is a natural monopoly, and it would be permitted to do so, assuming it's permitted to do so by the state in the form of higher prices to the consumer. So we end up with what? Higher prices, and law of demand says price higher, quantity demanded is reduced. So this kind of closes the loop on externalities and market power. So the next form of market failure has to do with non-rival goods. The concepts of rivality and excludability. Rival in consumption, meaning that by rival in consumption, we'll just cut right to the chase. Rival in consumption, what that means is that by consuming something, it's going to reduce the amount that's out there. Consuming your dinner is going to reduce the amount of food on your plate, for example. Excludability means that you can prevent other people from consuming those goods or services that we're talking about. So if it's on your plate, then you can exclude other people from using it. This is an example of a private good. So private goods, again, are rival in consumption, excludable. Your dinner, but we'll say an automobile is another example. So you can prevent consumption and you can exclude people from using it at the same. So your private vehicle, you purchase a new car, is 0 miles on the odometer, and you come back 2 years later and it's still your vehicle, and you've got 100,000 miles on the odometer. It shouldn't be that much, but anyhow. So you, by driving 1 additional mile, you're consuming the vehicle, we're assuming it's going to be used up over a period of time, of course, which is kind of normal. So the more miles you put in a car, the less vehicle, if you will, usefulness of the vehicle, however you want to say it, the utility of the vehicle is still out there. And you can also, it's also excludable in terms of you can prevent other people from using that vehicle, from putting more miles on your car, or you can allow them. It's up to you. It's your choice. So those are private goods. Public goods are the opposite. They are non-rival in consumption and they are non-excludable. So I kind of have this a little bit backward here, but the idea is that you can't reasonably prevent consumption, but it isn't used up, nor can exclude people from using it. Anyway, examples are much easier to see. So military, we'll just say the Navy, the U.S. Navy, non-rival in consumption and non-excludable. And when we say non-rival in consumption, just because we take our Navy and we put it in the shipping lanes to prevent piracy, moving it around, doing this and doing that, consuming that, if you will, it's not going to reduce the amount that's there. So we're taking advantage of it, but we're not reducing the amount that's there. And it's non-excludable in terms of it's very difficult to prevent other people from benefiting from it. Meaning, if you're in Kansas, you can benefit from it. You cannot be excluded from the benefits associated with keeping the shipping lanes open, right? By using the Navy. It's not just Hawaii or California. It could be, again, Michigan or Indiana or, again, as I mentioned before, Kansas, right? So this is the idea. The military is a classic example. And when we say they're non-rival goods, non-rival in consumption and non-excludable, these are called typically public goods, meaning the government steps in either to produce or to subsidize these. So government, of course, produces military. Flood control. This is our example where we have our rationale behind taxes is taxes are coercive in nature. People do not readily or voluntarily pay their taxes. They're compelled to pay their taxes. And our example for flood control is pretty straightforward. You have 10,000 people living below a dam, and that dam it's been up for 100 years, and it's actually a 50-year dam, so it has to be completely renovated, rebuilt, whatever. It has to be a significant amount of maintenance. It's going to cost millions of dollars to do that. Nobody wants to pay for it. So this is where we ask government to step in to address that issue. And this would be a public good, non-rival in consumption, non-excludable. Non-rival in that the dam itself is not going to be used up by just being there, and it's and non-excludable in that you can't keep people from benefiting from the use of that dam. The people that live below the dam, the people that use the dam, the dammed up lake behind the dam for fishing or other types of sporting endeavors, if you will. The other example would be fireworks, and that we'll leave it at that. These are public goods. They're non-rival in consumption, non-excludable. And we've already talked about private goods. Quasi-public goods are non-rival in consumption, and they are excludable. So you can't prevent consumption, but you can't exclude people from using it. Examples: post office, turnpike, state park. Post office, anybody can access the post office, can go into the post office, and by people going into the post office, it's not going to use up the post office. But they are excluded, actually, from doing what? The excludability piece of it comes in the form of actually utilizing the services of the post office, which are stamps, delivering mail. And so that would be the excludability part of it. You've got to pay for what? Accessing the services of the post office. Likewise, a turnpike, anybody can basically get on a turnpike, but in order to get off the turnpike, this is the excludability piece, in order to exit the turnpike, you have to actually pay. State park, similar, and I'm going to use this as an example along with something from the common good below. So those are quasi-public goods. Other examples, NASA would be an example. Lots of really good examples of quasi-public goods. Common goods are rival in consumption and non-excludable, meaning that rival in consumption, that by taking something, it's going to be consumed, it can be used up, but the non-excludability, this is the tough part, is that you cannot prevent people from accessing that good or service. So this is also termed the tragedy of the commons, and so our example that we use is the Grand Banks fishery off the coast of Canada. It's in international waters. So a Japanese trawler goes in and takes out 1 million cod from the Grand Banks fishery. That's going to be using up the amount of cod that are out there, meaning it's going to be consuming. So it's non-rival in consumption. Excuse me, it's rival in consumption, rather. It's going to be used up. And you cannot prevent the Japanese trawler from going in and using that because they're from consuming that cod, because it's non-excludable. Again, this is also called the tragedy of the commons. So the example that I was going to be using with quasi-public good and a common good was this. A state park, quasi-public good, and a common good in the term of municipal park, a city park, town park, whatever. And the idea is that the municipal park is there's typically no charge to get in. There's no admission charge, as opposed to like a state park where there is a charge. And so example being along the lines of the common good, the tragedy of the commons is that you would have a trash can, and you would still find a lot of litter. You tend to have more litter in a city park, a municipal park, than you would have a state park. State park, you have to pay to get in, and therefore, typically you have better services that would be provided with it, as opposed to a municipal park. Okay, so quickly with these two graphs, we're looking at demand side failure and supply side failure. We're asking government to step in to address the issues associated with demand side failure and supply side failure. On the demand side, what we're seeing is that the arrows should be pointing from D2 to D1, meaning we're asking government to address the demand side failure. We're asking government to step in to shift that demand to the right, to increase demand. And remember, moving to the right, whether we're talking about supply or demand, is an increase in supply or demand. And so this would be education, is our example. So without public education, we would be at D2. With public education, we would be shifting over to D1. So we're asking, in essence, government to step in to address this demand side failure, to shift our demand from D2 to D1, to lower the price or increase the availability of whatever that is. In this case, we're talking about education. The flip side of that is the external cost, or a negative externality. And what we're asking government to do in this case is we're asking them to cause supply side failure. And with supply side failure, of course, what we mean is that we're shifting our supply from S1 to S2, and as a result of which the price for that good, in this case electricity, would be higher. So we're asking government to do two things. First is to correct the demand side failure with an external benefit, positive externality, or to, on the flip side, on the supply side failure side, we're asking government to actually cause that supply side failure, to shift that supply from S1 to S2. Okay, so now moving on to the concepts of consumer surplus and producer surplus, and I'll walk through this, and it should be fairly quick. So the consumer surplus is the estimate of how much more the buyers in the market would have paid if they had to obtain the same quantity. in order to obtain the same quantity. At any rate, the consumer surplus, if we're looking at a demand curve sloping downward to the right, our typical looking demand curve with our price on the y-axis, the vertical axis, and the quantity demanded, or quantity rather, on the x-axis. And so we have a product that's being sold at the current price, and what's formed by, there's what's called the revenue box, which is you take the line, the horizontal line from where the price is at over to the demand curve, and then down to the quantity axis, the x-axis. And what's left is that box, that's the revenue box. Revenue is equal to price times quantity. So whatever that price is at, and the related quantity on the quantity demanded on the demand curve, from the demand curve down to the quantity axis, the x-axis, that again is the revenue. Revenue is equal to price times quantity. So that is what the consumer is actually paying for something that is flowing through to the firm, right? So what the consumer doesn't have to pay is represented by the triangle that's above that price line, again bounded by that price line, and at that given price, the y-axis, the price line, and also the actual price, that horizontal line going across to that demand curve, and then up the demand curve back over to the price line. That's the triangle that represents the portion that the consumer doesn't have to pay. So therefore, who gets the consumer surplus? Yes, the consumer. So taking this next step, taking this apart in terms of the consumer and producer surpluses, and taking this, drilling down on this a little bit. Remember, anytime you've got a downward sloping demand curve, that represents some price power, some market power. So as a result of which, the price power, market power manifests itself in that producer surplus. So again, we're showing the consumer surplus on the top of that price line, again bounded by the price line and the vertical axis, price axis, and the demand curve itself, the triangle that's associated with that, that's the consumer surplus, the portion that the consumer doesn't have to pay. The revenue box is that bounded again by the price line going across to the demand curve and down to the x-axis, or the quantity demanded. That represents the entire revenue that's flowing through to the firm. And what we have in the red shaded area if we divide that box into along its supply curve, if you will, above that supply curve represents what is called the producer surplus. So that is the portion of that revenue that the producer is getting in excess of its opportunity cost. Its opportunity cost is represented by the lower portion of this revenue box, that triangle on the lower portion, again bounded by the quantity demanded line, the supply curve, and also the quantity demanded x-axis. So that would be the opportunity cost associated with the production of whatever it is that we're producing. Meaning that when we say let's just say that the revenue in total is $100,000, and it's pretty much cut in half. So half of that represents the opportunity cost. That means that $100,000, $50,000 of that it goes to the productive resources for the use of their to the household as owners of productive resources for the use of those productive resources for their labor, entrepreneurship, capital, and land. So that covers their opportunity cost. Remember, opportunity cost means that it covers it's your next best competitive option. So this is, you're receiving your just desserts, you're receiving what you deserve. What the producer surplus, that flip side of that triangle, the other $50,000 of that $100,000 in revenue represents the producer surplus. That portion which the producer, in this case we'll say the firm to start with, is receiving in excess of its opportunity cost, the cost that had to be paid to the productive resources for the use of those productive resources, the household rather, for the use of their productive resources. So who gets the producer surplus? Yep, the producer. Consumer surplus, the consumer gets it, the producer gets the producer surplus. Not the firm. The firm is the first stopping point. But what happens is it flows back through to the owners of those productive resources, to the labor, entrepreneurship, capital, land, some combination thereof. Maybe it all goes to the entrepreneur, who knows? But this is that producer surplus it goes back to the household, the ones that are the household that is employing the productive resources at that firm very, very specifically, okay? Okay, so in this representation, we're using oil, and hopefully the price of oil will be coming down at some point, but at any rate, we'll just use this price of oil being at $50 a barrel to start with, and it's being shifted up to $70 a barrel. And the way that the prices are increased is gone over this on many occasions is by reducing supply, restricting supply. It's not just a matter of raising prices, you're restricting supply, and by restricting supply, by raising prices that way, through the restricting supply, you end up higher on that, you end up with a higher price and you move up to the left on that demand curve. The idea, of course, is that you're trying to, all you care about is revenue. And if you have market power, you like to, if you want to exercise that market power, assuming you're in the inelastic range, and a lot of other things come into play, but you get the idea where it's going to be what? Revenue enhancing. Because remember, revenue is equal to price times quantity. All you care about is increased revenue. So we're going to raise prices through restricting supply in order to what? To increase our revenue. So as a result of which, what happens is that you notice that the producer surplus, you add that portion with, because of the higher price, you're adding to that producer surplus. To start with, we'll back up, you're actually reducing the consumer surplus. You're adding to the producer surplus, and you're also ending up with what's called the deadweight loss. The deadweight loss is something that's taken away from both the consumer and the producer. The consumer is certainly harmed, but the producer, even though that they're surrendering a portion of their producer surplus, they're gaining in a net sense because by taking more away from the consumer. So again, bottom line is that if you're able to exercise your market power by raising prices through restricting supply and assuming you end up with more revenue and there's nothing to stop you, competition, then you go ahead and do that. You do just that. And so this is our example of increasing market power or increasing increasing market power through restricting supply. Yes, just as market power can increase, it can also be reduced. It can be taken away. That market power can be reduced. And how that happens is, of course, through added competition. Added competition, and our kind of key to adding competition, adding production, adding producers, we'll just assume it could be just added production, but it could also be through added, increasing productivity within the firms themselves, or in the case of oil, we'll say that there could be substitutes. So in the past, when I say oil or energy production, the U.S. is a classic example of this. And so what happened in the U.S. going back to about 2008 and going back prior to that, another, for 30, 40, 50 years prior to that, we were importing a terrific amount of our energy, oil and natural gas. We were importing a lot of natural gas from Canada and Mexico, and we were importing natural gas or oil from anybody that we could get any oil we could get our hands on. We were importing, of course, from Mexico and Canada, but we were also importing from OPEC. And so what happened around 2008 was that fracking came into practice, and this is our substitute. It's not really a substitute, but it certainly looks like a substitute, meaning that with fracking, we were able to compete with traditional extraction processes for oil and for natural gas. We were able to add to the overall supply. And by increasing the supply, in this case, moving from 15 million barrels to 20 million barrels, for example, we're shifting that supply from S2 to S1, and what that does in effect is it reduces that producer surplus adds to the consumer surplus, and it also, in the process, eliminates the deadweight loss. So this is a win-win for the consumer, for the household as consumer in particular. It's a loss, of course, for the, in terms of the producer surplus for the owners of those productive resources that are employed at this firm. But the reality is that all of us are consumers. I remind you of this all the time. I have to remind you of this all the time, that we are all consumers and we all benefit from what? Lower prices. And we like lower prices, and even if we are household that works at this firm where there's a significant amount of producer surplus and we actually benefit from it, we still have to pay higher prices. So the reality is that all of us are consumers and all of us benefit from this. Some more than others, but for the most part, not. I'll leave it at that. Is that it's beneficial to the household as consumer, period. Okay, so government's role in terms of, this is chapter 5. It's government. We start with government's role first. It's resource allocation. We're addressing the suboptimality in terms of externalities. So suboptimality means it can be too much or too little, either or, right? So that is when it's too much or too little. It's think of the three barriers. When it's just right, then it's optimal. For education, for example, if it's suboptimality, if we have a positive externality, we increase the quantity of education or reduce the price of that education. And as a result of which, we alter the input mix. We hire more teachers, we employ more teachers, and we employ fewer auto managers, we'll say, supervisors or whatnot, and auto workers as well, I guess you could say, on the input side. So we're redeploying those resources, more teachers and fewer private sector workers, if you will. And as a result of which, we're also altering the output mix. We're producing more education. We're producing more public goods, but the trade-off, of course, is that we're producing fewer private goods. Fewer vehicles are coming off the line than would otherwise be the case. Anyways, you get the idea. So we task government with this resource allocation, reallocating our productive resources in essence, right? And also on the output side, so it's input and output. Secondly, we turn to government for stabilization. That would be a fiscal authority, monetary authority, and very briefly, the fiscal authority would be the taxing and spending authority or legislature. And on the monetary authority side, that's the Fed or the Federal Reserve. So stabilization, what we mean by that is that if the economy is growing too fast, inflation, we typically would ask the Fed or the monetary authority to step in to do what? To drive up interest rates, make it more costly to do business. We could also, on the fiscal authority side, say, well, we can increase taxes, because by increasing taxes, remember our income goes to taxes, consumption, and saving. So by increasing taxes, it reduces consumption, which would cause the economy to slow down. Then we could look at it the other way around in terms of if the economy is in recession, we could, the fiscal authority side could reduce taxes, lower taxes, increase government spending. Monetary authority side for the Fed, the Federal Reserve, they could lower interest rates, right? And there is actually a fourth portion of this. This is coming from a professor by the name of Musgrave. This was from 60 years ago, or the purpose, if you will, of government in terms of addressing the concerns, the needs of society. And it was public finance is the term. Anyway, 3 is the redistribution of income, and that's at the federal level. At the very least, we're looking at a federal progressive tax, graduated income tax scheme, where the more income that you make, so you earn $100,000 a year. Sounds good, right? So the first $50,000 a year, $50,000 of your income, you're taxed at we'll just say a 10% rate. And for the next 50,000, so from $51,000 up to $100,000, you would be taxed at 20% rate. So that's a graduated tax scheme, or higher, marginal tax rates. So you're paying higher marginal tax rates. This is the idea is, of course, that the more income that you earn, one of the roles of government is to try to make the income distribution more equalized, right? We've already talked about that, equality versus equity, et cetera, but this is where we ask government to step in to do this, and what they do with those taxes are address those externalities and public goods, but also transfer payments. Transfer payments would be payments going to the households in the form of direct payments, such as like Social Security, some welfare payments, or in-kind transfer payments, which would be along the lines of Medicare and Medicaid, health insurance type things, where you're not paid, but the provider of your service is paid directly. Okay, so you're paid indirectly that way. Chapter 5, more specifically, government failure. We've kind of talked about this already, but the idea is layered government is a problem. Layered government meaning that you have, example, EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. There is a federal Environmental Protection Agency, but there's also a state form, and that would be the Department of Environmental Quality in Michigan, which is now, I think it's EGLE, it's Environmental Great Lakes, something or other. That's there. And so, and there's also probably at the local level, at the county and the local level. So you've got this layered government. The problem with layered government is that they all want the responsibility, of course, until there's a problem, and then no one is responsible. It's the other guy's fault, if you will. Further, the layered government can be a very expensive proposition. It gets very, very costly with these various layers of government having to pay for them. Public choice, principal agent, same thing, basically, same ideas. Public choice is kind of a cynical approach, but the idea is that the primary role of a politician is to be rehired, to get reelected over and over and over again. Principal agent problem, which goes in concert with that, is that we've got a private form of it, private sector form of it, as well as a public sector form of it. The private sector would be, the principal would be the owner of the firm, the shareholder, the stockholder, the bondholder. The agent would be the executive officers, would be the CEO, et cetera. On the public sector side, the agent would be the politician, and the principal, of course, would be the voter, and they do not always mesh, the same ideas. They have different goals, objectives, if you will. Regulatory capture, very quickly, regulatory capture, the regulators become captive of the regulatees, and our example for that would be the public service commissions, so far as like the governance of the natural monopolies, where the natural monopolies actually end up being in control of those regulators. Unfunded liabilities would include such things as Social Security, Medicare, state-funded pensions, meaning that there are promises to pay, but there's not enough money out there to pay those, and we'll be talking more about that later. Okay, that's it for this. Okay, so now we're moving full force into macroeconomics with Introduction to Macroeconomics, Chapter 26. Starting with unemployment, we're talking about, when we refer to unemployment, that's measured by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is under the Department of Labor. And they actually have 6 measures of unemployment, or underemployment, as it's probably more accurately referred to as. So the one that we look at in terms of like being the official form of unemployment would be U3 unemployment rate, which is the one that's published on a monthly basis. Those are the numbers that we see, that we hear in the media, and so on and so forth. But specifically, when we talk about the U3 unemployment rate, that refers to, you have to meet 2 criteria. One, you have to be not employed, makes sense. and 2, you have to be actively seeking employment. So that's that second piece. Both of these have to be in play, but that second piece in particular is important because if you're unemployed for a significant period of time, you reach a point where you may give up looking for work. You become what's called a discouraged worker. So that would not be counted as U3 unemployed. Keep that in mind going forward. So the different types of unemployment would include cyclical unemployment, which has to do with the business cycle, which we'll be speaking to shortly. And secondly would be frictional. Again, there's no particular order, but frictional unemployment would be between jobs, where you quit a job or you're out of a job and you have a job lined up, you're not really working yet. You would be counted as frictionally unemployed. Next would be seasonal unemployment. Seasonal unemployment, of course, has to do with the seasons. So if you're a greenskeeper at a golf course, you're only working when the golf course is open. So April through October-ish, if you will, depending upon where you live. So that would be seasonal work, seasonally unemployed. So when you're not working, if you're not working, and if you're a greenskeeper and it's December, chances are you're not working and you would be seasonally unemployed. Structural unemployment is the most difficult one to deal with because structural unemployment means that your job went away. Perhaps you were replaced by a robot, something along those lines. This is the one that's the most difficult to deal with because this involves significant amount of retraining, formal and informal training, certifications, so on and so forth. So that's structural unemployment. Full employment is, our definition for full employment is that there is zero cyclical unemployment. So this is at the top of the business cycle. When there is zero cyclical unemployment, we have full employment. We will certainly have some amount of frictional, seasonal, and structural unemployment. Michigan in particular had a lot of structural unemployment, even at the top of the business cycle over the course of the last 10 years or so. As the nation was kind of moving along, Michigan was a bit of a laggard because of that structural unemployment. The next piece, we'll pass on the natural rate of unemployment. That's just when the labor markets themselves are cleared, when it's at the equilibrium point. Speaking to the business cycle specifically, we have full employment again. That's zero cyclical unemployment. We're at the top of the business cycle. And so if we're going down into a business cycle or an economic cycle, what happens first is that we see a drop off in productivity because we're still fully employed. So put your entrepreneur hat on. You see a little bit of a downturn. You know, you're in a week where you're anticipating a certain amount of growth, sales, etc., and that fell off a bit. So you're not terribly concerned about it. You're a bit worried about it. So you scale back on the hours that your people are working. So rather than working 40, 50, 60 hours a week, they're working 20, 30 40 hours a week, we'll say, something along those lines. So you pull back on your production, on your, the use of your labor, for example. And it could be any or all of the productive resources, but we'll just kind of stick with labor for our examples here. So you are utilizing your labor less, so your productivity has declined a bit because otherwise, if you continue to build at the same level or produce at the same level, you're producing more inventory. That's more cost to you, and it's not in your benefit to do so. So the next step, of course, is that if you really do run into a situation where there's a significant drop-off, you may have to start laying people off. This is when that U3 unemployment number starts to pop up, starts to rise up. And so that would be at the 3, if you will, along the stage here. The next thing we encounter is called the discouraged worker effect. So there's a time element involved here. And what that means is that if it's a significant amount of time, you may have people giving up looking for work. So the question is, what happens to that U3 unemployment rate? The U3 unemployment rate, it actually goes down. Unemployment rate goes down because people do what? They're not employed, of course, but they stop actively seeking employment. They become discouraged. The discouraged worker effect actually drives down that unemployment rate, the U3 unemployment rate. Recession, of course, is 2 consecutive quarters of negative real GDP growth, so this may or may not be a recession that we're talking about, the business cycle, but just say that we are. So as we're coming out of this recession, we don't know if it's real or not. We don't know if we're going to have a double dip recession or if this is just a little blip in the system. But at point 5, we see our productivity start to rise. We don't hire more people back yet because people are expensive. They're costly in terms of training and so on and so forth, which was why in the first place, when we had our productivity decline, we didn't lay people off because it's very difficult to get your people retrained, to get to get people back into the workforce trained up properly. So we're at 5, the productivity starts to pick up. So now you're working not the 20, 30, 40 hours a week. You have your people working 50, 60 hours a week, working lots and lots of overtime, if you will, hopefully. And then onward, the economy continues to grow, and we encounter the encouraged worker effect. And what's odd about the encouraged worker effect is that you actually have that U3 unemployment rate start to rise. And the reason it starts to rise is because people realize that there are jobs out there, and they kind of move into that frictional, hopefully, unemployed category, if you will. But nonetheless, we actually have an increase in the unemployment rate, which is a good sign when we're talking about the encouraged worker effect coming out of this recession. 7, that the unemployment itself, that U3 unemployment rate, starts to drop in earnest as we move back to the top of the business cycle. So again, now graphically, we can also look at that business cycle in another way. We can look at it in terms of demand side failure and supply side failure. And what we mean by this is that when we have demand side failure, that's representative of the economy collapsing for whatever reason. And the demand starts to weaken. For our products, we start to build inventory, and we're not selling as many products as we had before, so demand is shifting from D1 to D2. So the typical response to that would be, if you have competitive markets, is that the price would drop, and you would clear those markets by via sales, increasing your sales, what have you. Anyway, so reducing your inventory through reduction in prices, reducing that surplus, reducing that that glut, if you will. That's the excess inventory that you have. But what happened was, an example, our Great Depression, we had a collapse in demand followed by a collapse in supply, and the purpose was to maintain price levels, and the firms reduce the supply in order to maintain their maintain their profit margins. So they sacrifice sales by shifting supply in response to that shift in demand. So the objective was the supply side failure was shifting, from S1 to S2 in this case. This was the firms that had market power. So example I turned to is Henry Ford, but it wasn't just Ford, it was across the board in many, many industries. But the idea was that rather than reduce prices, you're going to be shifting your supply to the left. And as a result, if you look on the right, under our Great Depression model, you had demand shifting from D1 to D2. That was the demand side failure, followed up with a shift in supply from S1 to S2. And the objective was to keep price levels, maintain price levels, maintain profitability. The problem with that, of course, is that since you don't have the mechanism in place with flexible prices, you have sticky prices, and as a result of which, since you have market power, there's not sufficient competition to drive down those prices, you end up with reduction in production. So you're reducing production. And as a result of which, of course, since the firm is actually shrinking, if you will, it's going to be requiring fewer of those productive resources. And staying on the labor side of this productive resource mix, it would result in what? More unemployment, increased unemployment. So this is kind of what exacerbated the situation in the Great Depression. There are a number of items that were things that were involved with this, but that was certainly a large one, that supply side failure that followed that demand side failure. So when we talked before about the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, they're the folks under the Department of Labor with the help of the Census Bureau, the great counters out there, right? The people that do our census on a 10-year basis, it's decennial census. They count a lot of different things. Census, they do a lot of work for both the Bureau of Labor Statistics and also for the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Um, at any rate, so this when we're looking at the employment numbers, if you will, one of the key things we want to look at is the labor force participation rate. The labor force itself is equal to those folks that are employed plus those that are unemployed, meaning those U3 people, those folks that are not employed but they're actively seeking employment. And the next component that we're looking at is the civilian non-institutional population. So the numerator, the one on top, is the labor force, and underneath would be the civilian non-institutional population, or the CNP. Now, the civilian non-institutional population is a subset of the overall population. So the U.S. population, say it's about between 330 and 340 million people. And so if you take out those folks that are 16 years of age and younger, and also those other people that are counted in institutions such as in the military, prison, nursing homes, etc., that are counted by institutions, that reduces down to that civilian non-institutional population. So in January of 2022, the civilian non-institutional population was at 263 million. Likewise, or also, the employed portion of the economy, of that labor force was 157.2 million, and the unemployed were at 6.5 million. So you had a total labor force of 163.7 million people. So you take that 163.7 million divided by the labor force, divided by the 263.2 million in the civilian non-institutional population, and you ended up with a labor force participation rate, again, employed plus unemployed divided by the civilian non-institutional population in January of 62.2%. Now, going back to January of 2020, it was at 63.4%. So this was right before the COVID collapse, if you will. Right on the cusp of it. The COVID, the pandemic began in February of 2020. So this would have been January of 2020. And the interesting thing about it was that number in January of 2020 was the highest since 2013. So there was a long road back from prior to the Great Recession of 2008, which, by the way, going back prior to that, between 2000 and 2007, the average labor force participation rate was at about 66.5%. So it is significantly higher than it is today. A lot of different reasons for it, and we'll be getting into this in greater detail. Some of it has to do with retirees. Remember, counted in that civilian non-institutional population, it not only includes all those people that are employed and unemployed, the labor force, but it also those people that are not in the labor force. So about 100 million people that would be either discouraged workers, given up looking for work altogether, or perhaps a good portion of them would be retirees, people that are, we'll just say, 65 years of age and older. Anyhow, there's more to follow on that as we move forward in the class. So briefly, we're going to be covering the per capita GDP, and whenever we see the term per capita, per person, capita means person, per person, the per person GDP. So example of that, of course, would be the U.S. has a high per capita, it's the largest economy in the world, so it has the largest GDP, but we also have a very large population at 330 plus million people. So our per capita GDP, I think the number was at about $65,000 per person, right? The per person GDP, as opposed to a tiny country like Luxembourg, which is very, very wealthy, it's a tiny country, but has a tiny population, but it's got a fairly sizable GDP. So as a result of which, the per person GDP in Luxembourg is probably twice as large as the per person GDP in the U.S. China is a lot larger than the U.S. population-wise, but its GDP is not quite as quite as large as the U.S. So its per capita GDP would probably be 1/2 to 1/3 the size of the per capita GDP in the U.S. So keep that in mind. It's the per person GDP. Onward. So when we talk about the different types of price level changes, we're talking about inflation, deflation, disinflation, stagflation. Real quickly, inflation is an increase in prices over a period of time, yearly, monthly, however you want to measure it. Typically what we do is we look back 12 months from what this current month back 12 months, or the last month back prior to the prior 12 months, to see where we're at so far as the inflation is concerned. Deflation would be the opposite of inflation, so it would be a drop in prices over a specific period of time. Disinflation is a reduction in the rate of inflation. So we're at 7.5% inflation and it goes down to 6.5% inflation. You still have inflation, but it's at a lower rate, so that would be disinflation. Stagflation is an old term that unfortunately has a way of creeping back in. And what that means is that we have recession. The economy is not doing very well. And we also have inflation at the same time. That's a tough one to deal with. We've dealt with it in the past, or we experienced it in the past in the 1973, 1979 through the we'll just say up through the early 1980s, when we had very, very high energy prices, but we had very slow economic growth or negative economic growth at times, where we would have had recessions, encountering recessions. That's stagflation. So we have inflation, but the economy is in recession in essence. So looking at our circular flow of financial activity, on the right, taking this apart, we're looking at the deficit budget unit on the left and the surplus budget unit on the right. And what we're looking at is the relationship between the two. The deficit budget unit are net borrowers. Surplus budget unit are net lenders. So you can think about it in terms of ages. It's not necessarily the case, but it's just kind of easier to deal with. When you're younger, you don't have as much income, you don't have as much wealth, you have not acquired as much wealth, and so as a result of which, in order to live your life, in order to pay for school, pay for cars, pay for homes, provide for your family, you often have to go into debt. This is a deficit budget unit territory where you're borrowing more than you're lending. You are a net borrower. On the other side of the equation would be a surplus budget unit, meaning that you have more. You have the opposite situation as the deficit budget unit. You have all those things. You've acquired all of those things. That's just in general we're saying this. So you are a net lender overall, meaning that you have more financial assets or more financial wherewithal, and the reason that you try to build up that nest egg, if you will, is for what? Retirement, when you're no longer working. So you have two parties that have a problem. The deficit budget unit needs money, and the surplus budget unit needs to lend that money in order to get some interest, in order to survive through the years when they are retired, when they're no longer working, when they're no longer receiving income. So direct finances between the two. Directly, this is borrowing and lending between yourself and your Uncle Vinny, and oftentimes there's a mismatch. Uncle Vinny wants to charge you too much interest, and you don't want to pay as much interest. So that's when we go through the indirect finance route, where we go through depositories, through banks, through mortgage companies, through different financial intermediaries, pension funds, insurance companies, in order to kind of bring these two parties together, the deficit budget and the surplus budget. So the financial intermediary is just that. It's a go-between, operating between the deficit budget unit and the surplus budget unit. Surplus budget, Uncle Vinny is not going to get as much interest as he wants, but more than what you're willing to pay, and you're going to borrow those those funds from the indirect financial intermediaries rather, at a bit higher of a rate than you wanted, but much less perhaps than what Uncle Vinny was willing to lend to you at. Lastly, just a quick outline of the different sectors along in the circular flow. We're looking at the household sector, the firms are the business sector, government sector, and lastly, the international sector. Just pointing those out. So this chapter, we're looking at domestic output and national income, the relationship between the two. So first, when we're talking about GDP, when we talk about GDP, we reference it in terms of real versus nominal. Real is that we're adjusting for inflation. So I have a dollar bill in front of me today, and its face value is $1, and it's worth $1. 1 year down the road, I take out that same dollar bill, and we have 10% inflation. The face value, the nominal value, is still $1, but the real value adjusted for inflation is 90 cents, okay? Just a kind of a point of reference. These are little reminders as you go along. So when we're talking about GDP, we're looking at it from, there are two different sides of the same coin, meaning the expenditure, the production side, and the flip side is the income side. Again, very, very straightforward. On the expenditure, the production side, the components of GDP, if you will, the consumption or personal consumption expenditures amount to 68%, 70%. This has probably been from probably a couple years ago, but it's pretty much in line with what it normally would be. GPDI is at 17%, and GPDI is gross private domestic investment, and that is the capital, the physical capital that we're kind of referring to when we're looking at our productive resource mix. When we talk about capital, it's the physical capital that goes in to the firm, into that sector, the firm. So this is the portion of, and the underlying part of that is, when we ever hear investment, we think financial. So the underlying part of that physical investment is the financial investment, if you will. But we look at it, at least in this context, we're looking at it in what's actually being produced. So that's the physical capital that's being produced at the firm for the firm. GC and GI, this is government consumption expenditures and gross investment. Short-term assets, they're not really assets, expenditure items, but they're things that are consumables. And the gross inventory, gross investment rather, would be aircraft carrier. So a pen, a government pen versus an aircraft carrier. GCE, government pen. GI, gross investment, would be the aircraft carrier. Long-lasting, long-term, durable good versus non-durable good type of an arrangement. NEGS is net export of goods and services. So you take exports minus imports. So in this case, we have a negative number, which means that imports exceed exports, which speaks to our trade deficit. At any rate, that's the expenditure or the production side, which points directly to those components of the GDP. Onward, the flip side of that same coin is looking at the income, so what we get for the use of those productive resources, if you will. 62% goes to wages or labor. 8% goes to small business in terms of profits for those small business, for those owners of the firm, if you will. So it's a profit. Rent at 4%, and that is the rent going to land. Speaking in the land not only speaks to the land, but also the use of those minerals that are included in the productive resource land, right? Profits, these are corporate profits flowing through to corporations. Interest at 4%. The interest that would be paid for by the firm, if you will, by the firms, also by government, I guess. I'm not sure if that's part of it. I think it is. Interest that's paid out to the bondholders, if you will. And lastly, transfer payments, not really counted as income, but it's for this purposes it is. And we're looking at transfer payments. That's what's being paid back to the household not for the use of their productive resources in the form of income, but being transferred from government sources or private sources directly back to the household, such things as Social Security payments, Medicare, Medicaid, welfare payments, etc. Okay, so the last thing we're looking at is we're talking about moving from GDP, gross domestic product, to national income. And there are a number of steps that include not just GNP, but also net national product, gross domestic output. There are a lot of different steps, but primarily what we want to focus on, the difference between GDP and national income, is depreciation. And we'll get into that in greater detail. But let's first walk through. GDP is gross domestic product. And that is everything that's produced in a country. It's the sale price, or excuse me, the value of the sales at the final goods and services that are being sold. Okay, there's a lot of words there, but the takeaway again is that everything's being produced and sold in a country for a given period of time. Typically, we're looking at a year. It's measured by the BEA, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and so again, that's GDP. Examples: Ford products built here in the U.S., and also we're looking at like Toyota products, perhaps, for example, or some other manufacturer in the U.S., some other foreign manufacturer in the U.S. That counts toward GDP. The next step from GDP goes to GNP, gross national product, and this is where we have what's the repatriation of earnings and interest. Anyways, the repatriation of earnings, for example, meaning that so Ford production in the U.S. stays in the GNP, but the Ford production in Europe comes back from Europe into the U.S. to be counted in the GNP, gross national product. Whereas the Toyota production in the U.S., that gets taken away and it gets sent back to Japan for Japan's GNP. So that's the difference between the two. The U.S., it's usually pretty straightforward. I think in recent years that we've had a higher GNP than GDP. What that speaks to is that the production overseas has been greater than the domestic nameplates producing overseas is more than the foreign nameplates being produced in the U.S. So Ford of Europe versus Toyota production in the U.S. The difference between the two is that the GNP or the Ford production is worth more. Anyway, it's not just Ford, but it's the overall look that we're seeking. So the difference moving from, again, GDP, GNP to national income, the difference is depreciation. And the way depreciation works is that, there was a $50,000 truck that was sold to a business. So that's added to that physical capital, that GPDI at the firm. So the firm, when it sells, and that was year one, it's counted in GDP. Year two, the firm sells $100,000 worth of final goods, which is added to year two GDP. However, what's embedded in that $100,000 in sales is $10,000 of depreciation. It's a depreciation expense, so it's a tax formula. You're using up a portion of that. It's an expense item because you're using up a portion of that truck over the course of this, over the course of year two, going on year two through year five. Anyway, you get the idea, is that it's being used up. That vehicle is being used up, and so that's the depreciation portion of it. And so what it does, in essence, is that it overstates the GDP, the gross domestic product, by $10,000 a year. So we have to remove that in order to get a really solid look at what's actually being produced, if you will, in real terms, so far as we're concerned, which gets us to national income, which is what really does concern all of us, right? When it comes down to it. So what I'm getting at is that national income is probably a better metric, better measure of economic growth, the health of a country than is GDP or GNP or gross domestic output or net national product. Anyway, that should just about cover it.